Hello, coaches in the motor learning and skill acquisition seminar at Smith College. I wanted to put together a brief screencast for you on learning outcomes. In past years, students have been a little bit challenged by the learning outcomes, and hopefully the screencast will set you up for success in understanding why learning outcomes are important, and then also understanding how to write them. So let's start out with looking at why learning outcomes are important. So first of all, they are the first step in the process of designing a practice session. So learning outcomes are your guides in developing the assessments and then the actual content of the practice sessions. And that concept comes from what I'll call an integrated training session. Let's take a look at that model right now. So an integrated training session is connected in three different corners. So let's say our learning outcomes are in the lower right-hand corner in this particular picture, and then we have our learning activities in the bottom left corner, and then our assessments up top. Well, all three of those elements need to connect with each other and connect back to each other. So if any one of those legs of the triangle, sides of the triangle, is broken, then the training experience, the learning experience, is going to be compromised as well. So everything must connect or the learning experience is broken. So if we take a look at a slightly different picture, I've tried to put it in order here. In this, you might be familiar with something called backwards design. And this model that I've put together kind of follows that, while at the same time kind of building upon that triangle I just showed you. So the first thing you do when you begin designing a training session or a practice schedule, whatever you might call it, is going to be identifying the learning outcomes. So this is you identifying the specific skills, motor behaviors, maybe knowledge or desired results that you want to see as a result of the practice session. Then the second step, moving over to the left there, is to determine your assessment. So how are you going to know if the learning outcomes were met or not? How will you measure it? What's the acceptable evidence that you'll use to tell you that the learning outcomes were met? And then finally, the third step up to the top is going to be planning. Designing the experience, choosing the instructional strategies you might use, and then also identifying resources. So that's kind of the three-step process of working backwards in a backwards design model, and just keeping in mind that learning outcomes are not something that float on their own once you come up with them. They really need to guide you, and they're designed to, if you come up with them first, use those learning outcomes, learning objectives. I use those two words synonymously. Use those learning outcomes to help figure out what your assessments will be and then what your content will be. So that's a little bit on the why. Let's take a look at the how. So when we write learning outcomes, it's helpful to start out with a formula. And there's a few different formulas that you can use. We have one for you in the course content that we've put together, and I have a slightly different one here for you right now. Ultimately, when I make learning objectives or learning outcomes, do I follow a formula? Roughly in my head, absolutely I do. I go for a general feel of one. I can tell if I'm missing a condition or the verb, or if I haven't given a specific standard to the learning outcome. So let me map some of that out a little bit. What I'm trying to say is don't be burdened by the formula, but certainly use the formula as you're getting started to make sure you're hitting all the key pieces of a learning outcome. But then as you get better, allow the formula to free you a little bit. So the sample formula I give you here is who will be able to do what, and what is going to be, maybe insert something from Bloom's taxonomy here. And if you don't know what Bloom's taxonomy is, that's fine. We're going to get to it in a second. And then plus a goal, plus a condition. So to put that in practical terms, to give you an example, the athlete will be able to apply the tape on top cue 8 out of 10 reps by the end of practice, right? And so let's say in this case, maybe tape on top is, maybe there's some tape on top of the hand here, and they're doing a volleyball hit of some sort, and that tape needs to stay on top, not only during the hit, but after the hit as well. So that could be a learning outcome that's written for that. Now, these are learning outcomes, not learning activities. So when you write your learning outcomes, you want to make sure that you're not simply describing the activity that you want the athletes to do. You're writing what the result should be. What do you want them to learn from this? So let's go into the taxonomies of learning for a moment. There's different taxonomies of learning, and you're probably most familiar with Bloom's taxonomy of learning. And Bloom's taxonomy of learning starts with remembering at the bottom. So these are like lower order thinking skills, right? So we're not talking about motor learning right now. Bloom's doesn't cover that. And then once you can remember something, then you begin to be able to understand it. From there, okay, now that I understand something, can I use the information to apply it in a similar way? And now analyzing, evaluating, and finally creating or synthesizing something new, that would be a higher order level of thinking. So when you're writing learning objectives, if you're with a group of people that are relatively new to content, you wouldn't expect them to create something new. That's a higher order thinking skill. You might just be looking for them to develop. You would be looking to develop learning outcomes that help them remember or understand. And then as the sessions go on, you can develop learning outcomes that scaffold from there, that build upon lower levels of thinking and work towards higher orders of thinking. But what about motor learning? Well, luckily, Gentile has a taxonomy of motor skills that is right here. And this can be complicated to look at. I do not expect you to memorize this, except for I do find it helpful. On the top here, you see it says body stability or body transport, and those are action functions. Or we can think about environmental contexts over on the left. So basically, is there intertrial variability or is there no intertrial variability? And then are these in motion regulatory conditions or stationary conditions? So just being aware of kind of those purple boxes and keeping those in your back of your mind when writing learning objectives might be helpful sometimes. But again, I just want you to know that this is there as a resource for you when thinking about writing learning objectives that are specifically for the development of motor skills. Now, there's a variety of other, Bloom's taxonomy looks at thinking and cognitive domain. Simpson, Harlow, Daves, they all came out with psychomotor domains. And here's Dave's psychomotor taxonomy, for example. It starts down in that orange. And this is where someone might be imitating a behavior while a demonstration is being done. So they don't have to memorize what the movement pattern is or positions. And then the green is manipulation. Okay, that's like the second order. So thinking back to Bloom's taxonomy of the pyramid, this is the same thing as a pyramid right here, starting in the orange and working up to the gray. They've just used a different graphic. Manipulation, and then moving on to the precision, articulation, and naturalization. And over here we have verbs for the psychomotor domain objectives, and those verbs, you could consider plugging in any of those verbs into the formula that I gave you earlier for writing a learning outcome. And this is another model. I'm not sure how well you can see it. It's showing up a little fuzzy on my screen. But this was developed by Atkinson in 2012, and it's kind of a version of Dave's taxonomy of psychomotor domain. And there are different what type of evidence are we looking for? Here are some different words that you can use for your learning outcomes. And then on the outer ring, you even have assessment forms. So this is a helpful way as well. Maybe, again, just use these models if they help you. And they might help you write some learning objectives, and others that you might just be able to write the learning objective without needing these models. So now that we've taken a look at some of the learning taxonomies, there are also a variety of online tools that you can use, like learning outcome generators. The Indiana University has one that is up on the screen there on the bottom. That's quite easy to use. And then there's also one, I think it's called Learning Outcome Generator, and that's the one where you see the picture of Einstein there. So these learning outcome generators walk you through the who, the verb, the goal, and the condition. Feel free to use these as you're learning to write your learning outcomes more effectively for your labs. So let's take a look at some examples here. So some examples of learning outcomes would be the players will be able to recite the 3 cues used for an in-step pass, maybe the cue is laser logo lever, by the end of class. So in that one, we can see that the who is the players, the verb is going to be recite, and specifically recite what? Recite the 3 cues, and the condition, you could say, is by the end of class. We have another example here. We have, by the end of class, each player will be able to hit a 12-inch target with a softball at a distance of their choice 8 times in 3 minutes. So this is a good learning outcome. Let's make it shorter and see if it still hits the criteria. So by the end of class, each player will be able to hit a 12-inch target. If we stopped there, we are leaving out the fact that it needs to be hit with a softball. We're leaving out the distance, which is certainly an important piece. And then the specific criteria or standard that we want to hold the athletes accountable to, and that is that they're going to hit this 12-inch target with a softball specifically 8 times in 3 minutes. Another example would be that the archer, this is for archery, the archer will explore and identify how to capture and direct attention needed to execute 3 cues, 9 out of 12 arrows when under pressure of time and, later, fatigue by the end of the session. And finally, the athlete will be able to execute a basketball shot from inside the key using beef on 9 out of 10 shots within the first 15 minutes of class. So there you have a few examples of learning outcomes. Let's just wrap up with a quick summary here. So why do we want to write learning outcomes? Well, learning outcomes guide session design and assessment. How do we write them? We can follow a formula, and in following that formula, we can consider a taxonomy or two. We could consider Bloom's. We also could consider a taxonomy that was generated more specifically for motor skills or the psychomotor domain. And when do we write learning outcomes? You're going to be writing learning outcomes whenever you begin designing a practice session. So I hope this brief screencast was helpful for you in learning how to write learning outcomes. If you have any questions, please reach out to one of us. Have a great start to your semester.